good morning, or no, just good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this webinar presented by both the West and East Midlands RTPI in conjunction with Design Midlands. We're going to be looking today with the help of our speakers at positively designing for climate and nature. That is to live more harmoniously with climate and nature, and to respond to some of the things that climate and nature are presenting as challenges to us. This is the second of 3 webinars looking at various aspects of design in the built environment. And in this session, we're going to be looking particularly at design solutions relating to the climate emergency, particularly how landscape and ecology and drainage should be used to underpin good design and help us to respond in the most positive ways that we can. We have 3 speakers, 1 on his own and 2 together. So I'll briefly explain who's going to speak. We've got Andrea Nelms and Catherine Phillips from PJA, Transport Planning, Engineering and Placemaking Consultants. I think Andrea is a specialist in drainage matters, and Catherine is a landscape specialist. And then second, we have Alex Wright, who is Professor of Architecture at the University of Bath. Just before we get on to the first session, a few housekeeping things I need to explain. If you look at the bottom right of your screen, there is a space where you can type in questions. I'll be trying to keep an eye on questions as they come in, so that when we get towards the end of the session, hopefully we'll have 15 minutes or so for a question and answer session, and I'll try and select those that I think are perhaps most pertinent to the issues that we've been focusing on. If you look probably at the top of your screen, there is a click point for handouts, and if you go onto that, there is a handout that you can download. If you can't download it whilst we're in session today, then I believe you can email and get that sent to you. There's going to be a feedback form at the end of the session, which should automatically pop up, and it'd be really good if you can give us feedback, because clearly we're trying to make sure that these events are improving all the time. So anything that you can do to help us with that will be greatly appreciated. I think I've covered all the things that I need to cover in that bit, so that really takes me into the first of the presentations, which is a joint presentation, or possibly a joint discussion between Catherine Phillips and Andrea Nelms, who, as I said, are from PJA Consultants. So over to you two.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Steve, for the introduction. So yes, as Steve said, Andrea and I work for PJA. I'm a Chartered Landscape Architect, Associate Director at PJA, and project experience covering both the public and the private sector, from conception to completion. And joining me is Andrea Nelms, who's a Chartered Environmentalist and Associate here at PJA, and she has extensive experience in flood risk management schemes, and more recently been involved in planning appeals. So today we're going to discuss how we're going to be looking at the landscape and water side of things, obviously being our area of expertise, around the arena of climate change, and how we can be more resilient to the future. And we'll discuss a few case studies and look at learning from each other. But I'm now going to hand over to Andrea to talk about some of the issues with climate change.
Should I just speak through yours?
Yeah.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Catherine. Just to contradict Steve slightly, yes, I do touch on that. I work in the water resources team, and I do touch on drainage and flood risk. But today I really wanted to cover water scarcity, because I feel like it's a bit of an unaddressed issue around development at the moment, and it's becoming more of a prevalent issue. But just to take us back to kind of setting a state of the nation type scene, and I appreciate most of you be well aware and well versed in what climate change is and the effects that we're witnessing as a direct result. But I just wanted to set the scene in terms of climate change, the water environment, and England's policy position. And then once I've depressed you all with that news, Catherine will swoop in at the end of the presentation and give her good cop bit, I think, and set out how we address some of these issues as planners and engineers to influence design, and how we make for a more resilient place to live in. But looking at the big picture, the world's population stands at 8.1 billion currently, and that's projected to rise to 9.7 billion by 2050. Quite startling numbers. But with this increase in population, we will inevitably place higher and higher demands on our resources, such as fuel, food, and energy. And as a direct result and a byproduct of consuming these resources, CO2 emissions will increase. And it's inevitable, unfortunately, as we have just witnessed in the media this week, that there will be a non-stop increase in CO2 emissions, and this is leading to a change in climate. Statistics currently paint a grim picture in terms of the impact, with rising global temperatures, melting ice caps, and extreme weather events as just a few examples of the alarming trends we're already witnessing. And this imbalance with our weather system is placing a significant strain on our ecosystems and ultimately ourselves. You may have noticed it has been a bit wet lately, and if you tuned yourself into Radio 4 the other week, you would have caught Baroness Young from the Environment Agency stating that the UK has seen its wettest period on record since they began in 1836, effectively turning Britain into a sopping wet sponge. This is mainly because as the atmosphere gets warmer and warmer, it's able to hold more moisture. And as a result, we have recently experienced a series of creatively named storms, Agnes, Babette, etc. And as you can see from the list on the right-hand side, these storm events are becoming a more frequent occurrence. But conversely, our summers are becoming and predicted to become even drier, presenting a real dichotomy and extremes in weather patterns, particularly within the UK, where we're not only experiencing an increase in flooding, but conversely, drought conditions during the summer months. And I can appreciate this is rather mind-boggling, given after all this rainfall, we're potentially still heading towards a water security crisis. And these extremes in weather patterns result in there being water when we don't want it, and water not having enough water when we do need it. Apparently, the country also endured its hottest June on record last year, just before we had the wettest winter. And during that summer period, many river levels dropped, riverbeds ran dry, groundwater levels were depleted, and the water pressure in our supply system was purposely reduced, and hosepipe bans were enforced. Granted, the blame can't be entirely laid at the door of climate change, but also attributable to a growing population, increased water usage, which we've seen since lockdown, and an old and failing infrastructure system. And recent analysis undertaken by the Environment Agency and DEFRA has revealed that several regions in England will face severe water stress by 2030. That's only 6 years away. The plan on the right-hand side on the slide is produced by the Environment Agency in DEFRA. That was produced in 2021. And it shows which water company areas have been designated as an area of serious water stress. So water security, I believe, will be the next big issue to affect the water environment and the planning system. Not to mention the sequential test at the moment and the potential coming of SABs. So as far back as 2009, the EA recognised that water resources were already stretched and published records on water neutrality. And in 2014, the Water Act was published, where the government recognised that greater resilience was needed to be built into the water supply system against drought conditions. As a result of one of the warmest summers on record in 2018, where temperatures excelled 35 degrees, a number of environmental incidences, including fish kills, algal blooms, were reported across the UK. And in response to this, the Environment Agency realised it needed to do more to protect our water resources, including groundwater within our aquifers as a source to river flows, but also water within our rivers and streams too. By ensuring a certain minimum level of flow in a watercourse, the ecological quality of a river can be maintained, and these levels are derived by the Environment Agency and are used to dictate how much water can be abstracted. In 2019, DEFRA under Theresa Coffey issued the Abstraction Reform Report, where all abstraction licences within England were reviewed, identifying that about 10% of surface water and 15% of groundwater abstractions were unsustainably abstracted, i.e. we're already extracting too much, or the total allowance for abstraction would cause environmental harm if this headroom was fully utilised. It doesn't sound like much, but this resulted in the EA issuing a policy paper in 2021, capping a number of abstraction licences and effectively reducing the amount of water available for abstraction. And this will come into effect in 2030. So what does this mean? Water companies now no longer have the water available they originally thought they had to sustain the projected growth as set out in local plans, and have been significantly caught out by this licence capping, putting them on the back foot in terms of how they will fill this water gap and meet demands, whilst those long-term intervention and strategic reinforcement measures, such as reservoirs and strategic bulk supplies and desalination plants, are coming to fruition. Reassuringly, Portsmouth Water is currently building a reservoir which is expected to open in 2029, whilst Anglian Water are pushing through plans for 2 more reservoirs, but these won't be online until 2035 in a best case scenario. And if you remember, I mentioned earlier that we are heading towards a situation of serious water stress within the next 6 years. So what can be done in the meantime? Well, Greater Cambridgeshire and Horsham District Council have recently announced as an interim measure, development can only be progressed if water neutrality can be achieved. A concept where any development that takes place must not increase the rate of water abstraction for drinking water supplies above existing levels. But on a pragmatic level, is this really achievable? But typically, when I wrote this presentation last week, we were still waiting, and my case study will be around Cambridge North, which we help support Brookgate through a planning inquiry on. There wasn't a decision by the Secretary of State on the planning appeal, but just yesterday afternoon that come through. So forgive me if I'm playing catch up a bit on this presentation. But so to touch on the case study on North Cambridge, it was this time last year where water availability in Cambridge became a very prevalent issue. And as I said, we supported Brookgate, who was the client, through the planning inquiry process, where they submitted a hybrid application for 3 new residential blocks, providing 425 residential flats and commercial buildings for businesses and R&D purposes. The site was allocated as part of Cambridge City Council and South Cambridgeshire's local plan, and as such was accounted for as part of Cambridge Water's Water Resource Management Plan, who maintained had a sufficient and sustainable water supply for Greater Cambridgeshire's projected growth over the next 25 years. The Environment Agency objected to the development on the grounds that additional demand for potable water use would increase abstraction and risk deterioration to water bodies under the Water Framework Directive in the Greater Cambridge area, and instead suggested that a water neutrality strategy be adopted by the developer to avoid this impact. So my role was to specifically determine how much this, what the water footprint would be of the development, and we looked to implement water efficiency measures, grey water harvesting, because believe it or not, Cambridge is actually one of the driest regions within Western Europe. So rainwater harvesting wouldn't necessarily be as effective in this region. So once we've been through this process, we managed to determine that the development would exact a demand of 89 litres per head per day, which is relatively low, and the nation's target, I think government's target, is 110 litres per head per day. So the EA were quite happy with our water efficiency proposals, claiming that it did set a benchmark for others to follow, but they still maintain their objection on the basis that cumulatively all the projected growth in Greater Cambridgeshire would have an impact and a deleterious effects on WFD water bodies throughout the Cambridgeshire catchment. So since this position the Environment Agency have taken, it's blocked the construction of more than 9,000 homes and 300,000 square feet of lab space due to these water issues. And as such, it's become a strategic matter. And the inquiry is now closed, but the appeal has been escalated to the Secretary of State. And as I said, the SOS has granted planning permission just yesterday afternoon for this development. Sorry, next slide. The reasons why water availability and scarcity is such an issue in Cambridgeshire is a multifaceted one, but is predominantly due to Cambridge being one of the driest regions in Western Europe and increasingly becoming drier due to climate change. The rate of groundwater recharge is reducing as a result of the dry summers we're seeing. And Cambridge water supply system is purely sourced from groundwater. And as we said before, the growing population where Cambridge is actually earmarked for an additional 150,000 homes is placing a severe pressure on this water system. So to mitigate the increase in water demand, Cambridge Water will start to roll out demand management measures, such as water efficiency, reduction leakages, but to adequately meet the projected growth in Cambridge, some large-scale national infrastructure projects are required, such as the Grafton Water bulk transfer, which is coming from Anglian Water, and a new Fens reservoir, again jointly being delivered between Anglian Water and Cambridge Water. But again, these strategic supply measures are not forecast to come in online until 2032 and 2036, respectively. So what can be done in the meantime whilst we wait for these strategic reinforcement works to come online and protect Cambridgeshire's chalk streams against the pressures of abstraction and climate change? Well, last month, the government announced that it has made a one-off commitment to work with local partners to address the deficit in water supply until water companies are able to bring major infrastructure online, and to deliver a new water credit system where developers in the Greater Cambridge area will be able to purchase water credits. And I imagine this will have to take place through the Section 106 process. And this scheme will be underpinned by major investment in measures to offset new demand for water in the area through retrofitting water efficient devices in existing buildings. But a key focus of this investment will be improving the resilience of the natural environment. Next slide. Thanks. So Cambridge County Council and other stakeholders are looking at instilling a number of nature-based solutions through the grant catchment programme. As you can see here, there's a list of nature-based solutions which essentially will aim to slow the flow down throughout the catchment, particularly at the head of the catchment, and natural measures such as wetlands, basins and woodlands will encourage clean surface water runoff to soak into the ground and recharge at groundwaters, whilst also reducing flood risk further downstream. The establishment of these habitats obviously will enhance biodiversity, but also help to mitigate the benefits by capturing carbon dioxide.
Thank you, Andreas. So I'm going to rattle through. I'm just conscious of time. I'm going to rattle through the next few slides. So Andreas started to talk about the things that they're doing in Cambridgeshire. But what do we need to do to make the environment more resilient? We need to make nature our essential ally in the fight against climate change. But there needs to be a synergistic approach, and there is a bit of disparity in local policy across the country. And I think it's up to us as consultants and town planners, within councils to sort of lead from the back in the absence of effective local policy. We shouldn't be just encouraging, but insisting on nature-based solutions with that synergistic approach to both natural and engineered systems, and looking at it in sort of at all scales. We need blue infrastructure in our schemes and our projects. They need to include small SUDS features as well as the big stormwater management, natural flood management, because nature is where people are happiest. It is very good for our health and well-being. And also we need to be ensuring that trees and the landscape is at the forefront of our schemes. Every tree counts, not just in carbon sequestration, cooling and shading, but from the developer's point of view, we all know that land values are lifted by having a nice green place, and there is a little bit of disparity there. There's inequality in some areas of the country where there aren't a lot of trees, especially in poorer urban environments. And we have biodiversity net gain that should help things. We are all now aware that, or we should all now be aware that BNG applies to pretty much all sites now, and that there needs to be monitoring in place to protect the habitats that are created on sites for 30 years after their inception. And it's not just about creating just any landscape on site. We need to be replacing like for like and making sure that we're creating that diversity. So how can we learn from each other? Lincolnshire County Council are a largely rural and pretty deprived county, but they are, sorry, Steve, yes, I'm just conscious of time. I'm just going to rattle through these very last slides. So they're actually taking a real pragmatic approach to open water and SUDS, and they will accept SUDS and adopt SUDS in the highways. If it is in the Syria manual, then they will adopt it. And they're actually seeing a 20% reduction in maintenance costs, which is pretty significant. And then places like Birmingham, in a much more urban place, they've got some really big changes going on in the city. There's some big drivers for change. They've got our future city plan, which is making some really big moves to become more sort of, you know, European, in that they're going to double green space to 30%. That's like Copenhagen, and they are looking to maintain their urban forest status, and they've got quite a lot of information about where trees are in the city in relation to also the economic whether it's a poorer area, and they're really trying to rebalance and readdress where there is inequality in, like, between wards. And ourselves at PJA, just taking Birmingham as an example, we've been working in West Longbridge, the old MG Rover plant, and they've opened up the River Ray, which was a channel in a brick-lined sort of culvert, and they've opened that up and created a new river, a lot sort of supported by the Environment Agency, and it was actually won an award last year for Regeneration Project of the Year. So I'm just going to hand you back very quickly to Andrea, just to finish off.
So yeah, just as we mentioned earlier, obviously there is an increasing pressure. The future challenge, as we know, is the significant housing growth needed to sustain this growing population. As we know, there's already a major housing shortage in the UK, and currently the government is pledging, and the Labour government, an additional 1.5 million homes to be built in the first 5 years, 150,000 of them potentially to be in Greater Cambridge. But this rate of growth and development will have a far-reaching consequence on ecosystems, agricultures, and ultimately human communities if not managed properly and sustainably. So how can we meet that challenge? Well, underwriting everything is policy, and on this slide I've just listed a few of those salient relevant policies with regards to climate change and the water environment. But so it's evident that the planning system and legislation which underpins it does not go far enough to protect the environment and enable development to adapt to climate change. And to paraphrase Baroness Young, the government has simply taken its eye off the ball, and we need to have stronger policy with regard to climate change and the pressures it's having on our environment. And put simply, it needs more welly. So what can we do as engineers and the role of town planners? Well, town planners play a crucial role in combating climate change by implementing sustainable urban planning strategies and helping to enforce BNG and water scarcity. We've touched on water security and landscape, but that's only just obviously a small part of it. And as planners and local authorities, you can prioritise the development of energy efficient infrastructure, encourage the use of renewable energy sources, and promote compact and walkable communities that reduce the need for transportation at policy stage. Town planners working as consultants can insist that schemes incorporate water efficiency measures, green spaces and sustainable drainage systems to mitigate the effects of extreme weather events caused by climate change. And by considering the environmental impact of urban development, town planners can contribute to creating a resilient and more climate-friendly development. Thanks, Steve. That's done.
Thank you very much, both of you. Yeah, I think this is the problem, isn't it? There is so much that we need to be thinking about and talking about, and trying to contain it within a very few minutes is virtually impossible. But thank you for trying, and I think there's a lot there to think about. Can we now quickly move on to Alex Wright, a Professor of Architecture from University of Bath? And whilst Alex is getting set up, can I just ask you, if any of you have got questions, please type them in and we'll deal with them in the time we have left. Over to you, Alex.
Lovely. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the earlier presentation as well. My day job is at the University of Bath, where I'm Professor of Architecture. I'm an architect by background, but I do quite a lot of chairing of design review panels around the southwest of England and in Northern Ireland. And I think part of my reason why I'm here today is around this work we've been doing with the local authorities in the southwest through Design West, which now have relationships with 10 of those local authorities, looking at large development proposals and strategic sites in particular. So I'm going to be really talking today, following on from what has been said around landscape and water, around other elements of the built environment and the climate crisis. I'm going to be talking a little bit about regenerative design, topography and typology. And for those of you that aren't so familiar with regenerative design as an idea, effectively it's really trying to move the culture of the built environment professions away from sustainability and the idea of trying to do less harm and move it to a culture where we try and do good and we try and repair some of the damage which has been done to our environment over the recent decades. It's quite a good little quote from Arups around what regenerative design is. It's about ensuring the built environment has a net positive impact on natural systems. And some people now extend that to include societal systems as well. Now, doing less harm is actually pretty tough, and it's quite hard to do, and it takes quite a lot of innovation, quite a lot of creative consultancy thought, quite a lot of design energy as well. Doing good is even harder, but the challenge we have is one which demands us, I think, to kind of move in this direction as swiftly as we possibly can and across as many fronts as we can simultaneously. So this sort of slide just diagrammatically shows what that's about, and it's about moving, if you like, into the positive territory on the y-axis, and so we're trying to move away from just kind of reducing carbon impacts, reducing impacts on the either through climate change or in the landscape that we are working within, and moving towards developments that do some positive good and have a remediating effect. As you think about that, what we're really concerned with is carbon. To be honest, all of this has a root in a lot of these regenerative ideas have their root in a real concern about carbon, and that's not just operational carbon, where maybe in previous decades we've been focusing our effort, but it's increasingly on embodied carbon and whole life carbon, thinking about the real carbon debt that the developments that we're currently putting forward kind of have in terms of their environmental impact. And this is an RIBA slide, and the residential wheel on the right-hand side is interesting in context of I think the 1.5 million new homes in the next 5 years, whatever, which have been just mentioned in the previous presentation. But actually, it's the embodied carbon which now represents, for most reasonably well-designed homes, the majority of the carbon that they will consume, their carbon debt, if you like. So effectively, if you build a new house, the energy embodied in that construction will be more than the carbon or energy associated with the whole life of that building. So effectively, whenever you are building, in some ways it's a dramatically unsustainable activity, because you are creating, if you like, something which just demands this kind of quantum of embodied carbon. So how we begin to address that as we've become better at managing operational carbon is becoming a bigger part of the prioritization of the overall carbon problem. And that has led to kind of a more high profile, I think, engagement with local authorities around whole life cycle carbon assessment. So now, as I'm sure you're aware, many local authorities are looking at or have adopted a requirement for some form of whole life cycle carbon assessment through the planning process, as a way of making sure that becomes part of the consideration of the merits of applications as they come forward. Standard model, which tends to be used, looks pretty much like this. It's obviously in various different stages or scopes, anything from the construction period alone, or what we call cradle to gate or cradle to grave, all the way through to looking at the life cycle stages, maybe at C and D, which until now maybe we've had less attention, which is actually what's the whole life cycle once you consider actually the end of life of that building and hopefully moving towards a more circular economy. Although currently still quite a lot of attention is at those early product and construction stages in understanding the embodied carbon associated with that initial build. So there's increasingly lots of guidance that's coming forward. There's a plethora of guidance now that's now available to design teams, applicants, local authorities as to how best to kind of implement these sorts of considerations within the planning process. And also kind of a growing awareness that sort of moving towards circularity in our economy is really truly the best way to try and achieve a more long-term sustainable objectives associated not just with the climate crisis but with other aspects of our environment as well. And it's hard work because for a lot of local authorities in the face of commercial pressures from applicants and the need to try to meet housing targets and the need to provide jobs and the need to provide infrastructure, all these things, there's a huge pressures on the system and changing the culture with respect to an understanding and appreciation of the priority that needs to be given to this understanding of carbon and the impact that has on our environment. Despite the declaration of climate emergencies, that's kind of helped promote some debate around this, but within the industry, it's proving quite a difficult task to kind of really have a meaningful shift in the culture around some of these discussions. And I'll kind of give a couple of examples of that. One good thing has been mentioned already, which is about biodiversity net gain. And it shows, if you like, that is applied regenerative design. It's effectively saying that if you are building something, you have to produce a tangible, measurable and managed gain in biodiversity, which will help combat some of the historical loss in biodiversity that the country has suffered over recent decades. So there are clearly ways in which this approach works. Applying it to the built environment, maybe specifically housing and other issues, is not without its challenges. One of the things I've been concerned with design review panels in southwest of the country is we're blessed with generally large areas of very attractive rolling topography and landscapes which are very much part of the landscape character of the area. Now, perhaps marginally less so in your areas, but where we've had problems in design review and I think with local authorities coming to look at these large-scale strategic sites, is that although virtually every applicant team will come to you and say, actually, we're working very closely with the topography of the site and we're respecting the existing contours. Actually, the more you look at it, the more you realize that maybe that's a very questionable assertion that's being made. And what you end up with is actually an awful lot of movement, regrading of the topography, movement of soil material on the site, which releases carbon and it creates groundworks and it does little to respect the existing landscape character. And it's part of the culture in which large-scale strategic housing sites have tended to be developed over many years. And that's really through the design process where the layout is often principally conceived or communicated as two-dimensional plans. It's given over to engineers who then have the task of making sure that the principal roads are kind of working to a maximum gradient, which they don't want to exceed. That has an associated cut-fill analysis. But what you end up with as a process is you end up often with individual plots or blocks of plots which are problematic, they're steep, you have a loss of landscape character due to the regrading of the topography, and you get this enormous release of carbon and needless expenditure of carbon by putting a lot of concrete into the ground to create retaining walls and other structures which would otherwise be required if a different three-dimensional, more holistic approach was taken. So it persists because it's actually it's an understood process. It's conceived as being easier and quicker, but as a process of developing these large kind of sites it generally offers less overview value, and it certainly is very rarely integrated in the sort of way that the previous presentation suggested in terms of blue and green infrastructure and existing features within the site. It's related as well to typology of housing, and I'm going to try and explain what I mean by this. I suspect, as with many things I've saying today, a lot of this will be known to all of you already. But effectively, if we're going to change cultures, we will no longer be looking to the typologies of housing that we've been relying upon for the last few decades. Effectively, those are deeply problematic if we're going to really address the climate challenge and the carbon challenge. And one of the issues, again, we hear is this understanding the impact of the hierarchy of design that was in the scope, if you like, of these of development and applicant teams within the planning process. And initially, function's important. If we need something or if we don't need it, that is often the biggest principal decision which can affect carbon cost. After that, it's about the form of housing and development, or whatever type of building you're looking at, employment, educational, recreational. And after that, it's really about the fabric, the lowest bit on the hierarchy. So I'm sure you're familiar with all these sorts of pyramids of influence and impact in terms of sustainable or regenerative design, in terms of benefit and cost. But one of the things we've found through the design review for the housing projects is trying to make kind of more use of sort of basic design parameters, such as form factor. So form factor, for example, is simply the ratio between the heat loss envelope of a building and the total area which is heated, and it measures the thermal efficiency of that form of building. And it gives you a number, so that if you look at semi-detached, attached, relatively low density suburban types of development, you're looking at a number around 3 or 4, just in terms of the form factor. If you're looking at kind of denser form of terraced housing, 2 or 3 stories, you're probably looking at a form factor of 1 or 2, and that's just just geometrically a kind of measure of the potential efficiency of different forms or typology of housing development. And it's important because if you are adopting a suburban form or typology of house type, in order to get the same performance as a typology with a better form factor, you have to increase the insulation within the built fabric of the external envelope. And the level to which you have to do that is deeply problematic, because effectively you get beyond the cost or the size of insulation where that becomes practical. So this is a little diagram which sort of shows the increase in U value you need to compensate for a poor form factor. And you soon get into the realms of really such increases in embodied carbon associated with that type of construction, or just the sheer practicalities of the thickness of walls and things, that you realize that actually, for many people, for many types of development, those kind of semi-detached, detached, low-density suburban housing forms are just almost impossible to make as high-performing in carbon terms as we need in order to meet kind of current aspirations around whole life carbon. So if anyone comes to you, and I've heard many design teams come to design panels and very proudly say, oh, we've got a fabric first approach, as though somehow that's a kind of, that's a golden ticket and solves the problem. I'd encourage you to interrogate anyone that says that, because I think in the current environment, I think it's highly questionable whether that's enough. And to be honest, form always trumps fabric. So we need integrated holistic design, and this is one part which I've just been talking about today, but it as has been mentioned, it's incredibly challenging, but it's a challenge which we've got the expertise and the ingenuity as a nation to rise to, but we need to start applying it, and we need to start doing it very quickly. And if you look at the sorts of developments coming forward over the last period of my professional life, these are just no longer appropriate or really applicable solutions for the middle of the 21st century. So there's a lot of developments that we should see, which for very good reason have a certain sort of form, a certain sort of arrangement of transport, land use, form of buildings, density, all these sorts of things. But actually, if we look fundamentally at what the modern challenges are, successful kind of regenerative propositions suited to the 2020s, 2030s, and 2040s will no longer look like this. And quite often in strategic planning, the plans which we're looking at today might not be built until 2030, 2035, and we're getting very close to the period then where carbon neutrality is an essential requirement if we get anywhere near the Paris Declaration and so forth, 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. So I've sort of finishing. It's obviously it's not just about typology and design. It's about method of construction, and modern methods of construction can be extremely important elements in thinking about whole life carbon, especially carbon during construction and end of life, and that's huge gains to be managed through that. And I quite like this William Gibson quote about the future. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, and I have the opportunity in my working life to trying to go to the places where the future is already here, but and trying to maybe publicize that and expose more people to the examples which actually current best practice in this country is very good. And so we do have examples which we can look at as a kind of indicators of where the future we want to be in, how it might be achieved. Again, I'm practicing a little bit on housing, but housing is such a big issue at the moment in my particular area. There is, for many years, there's just been a culture that effectively when you buy a home, you buy with it a liability. And that liability is the associated cost of essentially heating or running that home during a typical a year. And why is that the case? Is that something we should any longer really just assume as being a given within our particular climate, when there is the potential to produce zero energy homes, or homes which when you buy an asset, that you buy a home which is capable of generating more energy than it consumes, and something which has got economic benefit, let alone just the problems around fuel poverty and everything else. And these sort of zero build, there's quite a lot of work being done at the moment trying to make these more realizable. The initial sort of scoping projects sort of exist, and so we've got an idea of how they might work. Obviously, there's a huge amount of work to make them better and more flexible and more achievable, but actually it's kind of all possible, but it requires a shift, I think, in the culture of the industry in order to make these things as being seen as a kind of benchmark, which aren't just aspirational, but are effectively almost required. I'm sure you know this proposal is 10 years old now, or probably when it's designed even longer than that. It's maybe slightly frustrating to some people that actually some of the parameters or metrics that are achieved through this design, which has been around for such a long time, actually are still not being met by designs which are coming forward today. And there's this slightly frustrating lag in making sure that actually we are moving quickly enough in adopting best practice. And the scheme is clearly not perfect by any means, and the designers behind it have been constantly working to adapt and improve and develop the typologies that they've been working on through this scheme. But in many ways, we certainly shouldn't be designing now and with a view to building in 10 or 20 years' time, buildings which fail to meet the standards which we've already shown to be achievable. And actually, as these sorts of schemes and designs become more developed, the leading edge of best practice is always moving forward, and we just really need to use that in order to help drive up standards more generally and expectations across the whole industry. And so with that, I think, on hopefully a slightly more optimistic note, my time is up and I shall hand back. Thank you.
Right, great. Well, yeah, so much to think about, isn't there? So much so that, as I understand it, nobody's asked any questions yet, because I think everybody's stunned. So I think that then falls to me to ask a question to get us going. There's a massive problem, or massive challenge. Let's not call it a problem. In that we are, as an economy, as a society, sort of hooked into perpetual growth, and clearly perpetual growth does cause some contradictions, to put it mildly, when set against the requirements of ecology. Picking up on your point, Alex, particularly, but it also relates to the previous presentation as well. You said we need to change the typology, So we need to change the typology of houses, of buildings generally. We need to change the typology of places, particularly urban places. I'm just wondering if anybody amongst you has any particular views on how we actually persuade people that this is A, what's needed, and B, what can be done, and that it's something that they shouldn't fear. I'm particularly conscious of the controversies that have arisen with regard to the 15-minute city concept as a model, which is obviously not disassociated from some of the things that we've been talking about. And clearly it's very easy for things like this to be almost hijacked by people who have got all sorts of scare theories and conspiracy theories that they want to promote. So how as professionals and as professions working in a political environment, as well as the other parts of our environment, how do we really go about persuading people that this is needed, possible and desirable? Who wants to have a go? You don't have to have all the answers, just a suggestion.
I think from our perspective, somebody has to go first, don't they? Somebody has to actually give it a try, because unfortunately we are a little bit of I think we're possibly a little bit risk averse. So you need to see it by example, don't you, before before it'll sink in. But Alex is right. The modus operandi for developers is to just carry on doing what they have been doing for years and years, because they have the model in place, they have the financial models in place, and until such time as they are told they can't do it anymore, that will be the way that they will develop places. I know there are some developers that are looking to make massive improvements in their construction methods, but I don't know, Alex, what you think. I don't think it goes far enough at the moment, but I just think until it's law. I know Kevin MacLeod had a program recently, didn't he, about trying to get in on a developer forum, I think, and asking the big house builders what they were doing and to combat climate change, and it was met with quite sort of a lot of avoidance, shall we say. I think I'll stop there before I get myself into trouble, but what do you think, Alex?
Yeah, it is difficult because obviously change is a problem for everyone, but it can be invigorating. It can actually be freeing, and there will be people who will look at these opportunities and say, actually, this is a real opportunity for us to develop our construction industry, the way we build our ecology, our climate, our cities, our placemaking. Actually, you never want to let a good crisis go to waste. And if I'm going to be a little bit controversial, if we look back at some of the very large quantity of new residential housing and community placemaking that has been built over the last 30 years, there's been some wonderful examples of that. There's also been plenty which I think everyone's generally agreeable could be an awful lot better. And I think actually the challenge we have now is to kind of is for all those that are involved in the industry just to kind of realize the severity of what we're up against, and to say, actually, we have the ability, we have the know-how, we have the solutions which address large parts of this problem, but we have to start applying them at scale. And actually the planning process is critical in this, in changing the culture as well. I know in my local authority, when they've introduced a form of whole life cycle carbon accounting as part of the application for for anything above quite relatively small residential developments, and that has been not easy for the local authority, but it's already beginning to tangibly change attitudes, and actually the environmental consultants and those involved in, if you like, carrying out these exercises have moved up the chain and their influence in the design process. So they're no longer employed at the end to try and produce numbers on something which is a pre-existing scheme. They're brought in earlier and earlier, and that's part of the change we need to effect. And there's a huge amount of upskilling that needs to take place, because I've even seen it in the housing companies which I've been involved with. Actually, the further up the chain of command in those, the more appreciation of how urgent this is. But there's also the appreciation that you've got a massive upskilling of, if you like, the industry that needs to take place. But in the recent past, my general feeling is one of optimism. I think actually a lot of people really understand now the scale of the project, the problem, or the challenge that we face. And actually there's a real hunger to kind of develop personal and corporate expertise so that they can position themselves to really, meet these challenges as their schemes are coming forward, because nobody wants to be seen as being part of the old problem.
I think that's good. So basically, we need to move forward and get the good demonstration projects in place so that people want to do this. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually the public come with you very quickly. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm myself involved with a little housing. The houses which have been easiest to sell in the last 2 years have been the lowest energy, lowest carbon houses. It hasn't, and for years before that, people say, "Oh, we'll never sell them." But actually, since the energy shock, those are the companies that place themselves at that part of the market have really reaped the benefits from being, leading in that regard.
Okay, I've got two questions coming in. Try and get them both in. Susan asking, will allocating small sites rather than focusing on large sites help deliver change, helping smaller developers innovate, focusing more on dispersal? Quick answer to that one. What do you think? Is smaller more beautiful?
I think it requires a mix. There are certain things that big sites can do that small sites can't, but actually there's an awful lot of innovation that can take place at a large scale that can be scaled up. So I think not having a sole focus on just the bigger sites, but allowing, if you like, an ecosystem to develop in any area is useful, because the various scales actually all kind of mutually support each other, hopefully.
Good, thank you. And my second question, and I know I'm going to get this wrong. I think it's Raij Laxmi. I have a question to Alex again. Were you saying that the low rise has more carbon emission potential than high rise? There's a theory that high rise create more pressures on the land than lower or mid-level density. Can you just clarify?
Very good question. The research I've shown shows that there is a sweet spot. And if you look at the graphs, they cross, and this isn't going to be suitable for everyone because there are other factors involved. But essentially, if you're building at about 6 stories, in terms of embodied carbon, trade-off between building envelope, form, extra cost of carbon for higher structures, actually, the old 6-story cities, I'm thinking of Barcelona, Paris, London, actually that form is incredibly efficient in terms of its form factor and its the trade-off between structural concrete and actually they can work quite well in terms of densities, about providing cities which have got the characteristics which are dense enough to support reasonable coherent neighborhoods without excessive land use. So actually you're quite right. If you go above normally 6 to 8 stories, you are paying a carbon premium for putting accommodation at a large distance above the surface of the earth.
Interesting. Thank you for that. And he also asks, could you, and I think I missed this, but could you also clarify the theory behind circular buildings in your presentation?
Oh no, it's not circular, so I didn't mean that. I meant circularity. Sorry, my poor diction, apologies. I tripped over my tongue. So what I was referring to is circularity. So it's effectively when you're designing the product that you are using, you design into it its end of year passage back into its next life. So effectively it just means you're integrating recycling and reuse within the product chain for the building industry.
And very quickly, Andrea or Catherine, does that apply with water consumption and water use generally as well. So should we be aiming for more circularity in that sphere?
Answer that one. Sorry.
Apologies. Yeah, and I think that's what good exemplar sites are pushing towards, like Cambridge North, and that we are trying to utilise grey water recycling and rainwater harvesting techniques as best as possible. And again, to resound, Alex, on the local policy issue, yeah, we need a lot stronger local policy, and there's a disparity. I mean, just looking at the emerging policy in the Severn Trent region, which I know is in an area of serious water stress. There's one county council saying, we want to see water management statement, you must achieve 110 litres head per day on your residential developments, and then a neighbouring authority, there's just nothing there in terms of policy. So yeah, I think that circularity, if it's viable, obviously that's always the big question mark, is definitely.
Yeah, thank you. So the future is circular. That's that takeaway. Good. I think that takes us to the end of our session. So if I can thank all of you for presenting, thank everybody for coming along this lunchtime to listen to this and to see this. And thanks again to the East Midlands and West Midlands RTPI and Design Midlands. And I believe that takes us to the end. So I wish you a good rest of the day. Thank you.